Welcome to Tactics Talk, where we discuss all things military strategy. Today we're diving into chemical weapons and the strategies and tactics surrounding that weapon system. So there's going to be several PDFs down below. One of them looks like it was scanned from a fax machine from the 1920s. We'll be simulating these tactics within Flashpoint Campaign Southern Storm. Let's dive into this. Our current national chemical policy emphasizes retaliation and stresses that offensive capability should be considered for its deterrence value only. Next, first and foremost, deter the use of nuclear and chemical agents. Next, if this fails, to terminate the conflict at the lowest level of intensity possible and on the terms acceptable to the U.S. and its allies. Finally, the National Command Authority authorizes the use of chemical and nuclear weapons. The objective of the chemical and nuclear weapons is to convince the enemy that the objective cannot be achieved without unacceptable losses, i.e. deterrence. U.S. chemical use will be retaliatory only based on a policy of no first use. So to simulate this on the battlefield, we have several units. We have the Russians up here on the north, and then we have persistent chemical weapons from our 203s. We have standard high explosives. I'm going to explain the strategy behind that. And then we have non-persistent weapons on the battlefield as well. The difference is persistent will not leave the battlefield and non-persistent will vanish after a period of time. Now it's time to discuss some strategies real quick. So let's start with World War I. You're going to see an image pop up on your screen. This is about a breakthrough that took place on the Eastern Front. And the breakthrough kind of comes from a general who was considered an artillery genius. I'm going to butcher his name. Lieutenant Colonel George is what we'll call him, known as Durok Brook Breakthrough, and considered an artillery genius because his successes on the battlefield while on the Eastern Front. Bruckmüller, a great believer in the efficiency of gas shells, developed a highly sophisticated system of gas artillery fire. His tactical ideas were incorporated into the December 1917 edition of the German Manual for Employment of Gas Shells. And the Bruckheimer system created gas squares. So what you're going to see on this image are these dotted lines. This is where they recon troop concentrations. And as you see, there's actually little villages. And they squared off this area and kind of zoned in on areas where they would do like cloud concentration tactics, or where they'd follow up with high explosive gas shells that are also lined with chemical weapons, or just high explosive mixed with chemical weapons as well. So let's go. Bruckheimer's system created gas squares, which were areas known to hold enemy batteries or concentrations of enemy troops. These locations would be saturated by surprise gas shell fire, and lethal concentrations would be renewed by subsequent periodic fire. Bruckmüller's artillery tactics achieved surprise through the predicted fire method that eliminated the usual ranging of target by one gun of a battery. All right, so that was relatively simple and straightforward. We're going to close that image next. All right, infantry troops seeking shelter from high explosive bombardments were often forced into locations such as shell holes where gas settled. Furthermore, the concussions often stripped off a mask of the soldier's face, exposing him to gas, and more important, this tactic made Allied soldiers mask every time they were subject to artillery fire. That last sentence is really important because remember, when gas enters the battlefield, it slows the battlefield down immensely. So not only are we like bringing the battlefield to our terms, we're slowing down a breakthrough, we're opening up an area to be broken into. Or if we're the U.S., we're notifying the Russians that there are gas munitions on this battlefield and we're not scared to use them. And that's kind of how one of the PDFs concluded towards the end, was that the U.S.'s policy, while it doesn't maintain an offensive policy like the Russians do, they do want a policy that chemical weapons will be used on the battlefield, and this is how they will be used. We're going to dive more into the strategies and thinking of the Russians here in a moment, once we start talking about this. Now, lastly, we're going to talk about cloud concentration. So this is a tactic, it's fairly straightforward, and it sounds exactly what it's supposed to sound like. For the offense, it's called the surprise concentration of as much gas as possible through the sudden and rapid placement of shells on a target area, i.e. cloud concentration. Tactics imitated surprise tactics, but with an increase in the number of shells and the expansion and the size of the concentration area. So if we were to demonstrate cloud concentration real quick, now that we can start demonstrating real quick, we would grab like our non-persistent and we would say barrage, non-persistent chemical. Cloud concentration would start small in one area, and then we would slowly expand outward and kind of just create this hex. And then later, then if we kind of included more tactics into it, we would like layer an HE right here as well, which would kick up the gas, causing it to stay in the air longer. Obviously, that's not simulated in this game. Or we would just layer HE in here to just keep the enemy down and in a terrible position, knock their masks off their face, and just cause them to inhale. So there's really a lot of strategy when it comes to chemical warfare. So that's cloud concentration, very straightforward. We're going to cancel that real quick. And then we're going to discuss the U.S.'s strategy. So the U.S.'s strategy is far different than the Russians. We'll discuss Russians in a more offensive manner. But the U.S.'s strategy is basically to take a high explosive and just say suppression and just drop 1 or 2 rounds. Say commit to that, which is fine. And then to also say, hey, here's a barrage of non-persistent. We're just gonna layer that in as well. Right here, it's on the battlefield. It's going to slow you down. It's going to deter you from taking this fight. And if you decide to commit to this fight, you're going to have a bad time. So this is a bit different than the Russians thinking, or even like the Germans. So if you look at like the Iran-Iraq war, how they used chemical warfare, it was more of in Iran-Iraq, it was more of a terrorism usage. They kind of just bombed cities with it. Don't quote me on that. But we're on like a peer-to-peer battlefield right now, so we're just going to dive right on into this. So if we really wanted to simulate the usage by the U.S., this is one way we would do it. We would stop this breakthrough, we would slow it down, we would cause casualties, and we wouldn't saturate an area. Remember, we're responding. The U.S. knows there's chemical weapons on the battlefield, and if they do want to take this fight, then we've notified them that it's going to be a bloody one, and a lot of people are going to die. So if we really just wanted to practice with our cloud concentration, so let's just demonstrate the U.S.'s policy real quick. All right, so there's the first couple of hikes. Oh, actually, that's a gas right off the bat. So this is non-persistent. This gas isn't going to be on the battlefield for very long. There's a high explosive, so we're mixing all kinds of things in right now. That unit opted to move into it. So while this is playing out, we can talk about a few more things with regards to Russians. So the Russians have this strategy of using chemical weapons, not so much that the U.S. looks at it as kind of like not appropriate to use. Whereas if you think about it with the Russians, they've embraced the technology or the weapon system, and they train with it. So when you review those PDFs, it's going to talk about how the Russians build confidence around the usage of chemical weapons. They've layered it into their force structure, and they really embrace the technology. And obviously, it's been used in Afghanistan, Syria, rumors of it being used in Ukraine. I haven't really been able to find a lot of good links. And then several wars in the Middle East, like Iran, Iraq, and things like that, and then Iraq with the Kurds. So it is a very good offensive tool. And what separates Russia from the U.S. is that the Russians are embracing this kind of deadly technology. So as the U.S. Negotiates and like drawing down the chemicals, the U.S. Fulfills their end of the bargain. But as the U.S. starts to build up and determine and wants to explore the usage of chemical weapons, the threat actors like Iran, Iraq, the Middle East, Russia will all come to the negotiating table and try to deter the U.S. from expanding its chemical weapons usage. So that's something we can explore right here. So as of right now, we've identified all these units on the battlefield, and we want them right there. So once this is done, we're going to explore a few more strategies. We're going to demonstrate cloud concentration and how it's effectively used on the battlefield. And as you see, the enemy has really slowed down a lot. I mean, basically all they need to do was cross this area, but they're holding back their tanks. And there is like one small breakthrough right here, which we could handle with our Bradley. But these units are currently just deterred. I mean, they're Kurd. They had to put their mop gear on, whatever it is in Russian. So yeah, suits, boots, gloves, mask sort of thing. And that's really going to slow you down. That's also going to cause like a lot of energy waste usage for you. So if you spend a long time in mop gear, you're going to have a bad time. And this is only just like one small deterrent policy, like, right? This is just the US just dropping like three chemical gas clouds, and these are non-persistent, so these aren't going to be on the battlefield for very long. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to do cloud concentration. So we have what's going on right here is a unit that is basically shut down. We can't really see its stats too much. I guess we can a little bit. We can kind of see how it's affected, but we can't do too many things with this. And I don't want to go too much into game mechanics because we're mainly talking about strategy right now. So what we really could do is we could move to our persistent chemicals and start layering our cloud concentration. So we do persistent, not really super ideal. So let's say we really wanted to hit this area and we just wanted to do like a quick little cloud concentration. Right there, that's going to shut down basically this entire water crossing for hours. So we say commit. So that's no longer a problem for us. And then remember what we need to do next is we have several more on the battlefield. And then we could actually call in a persistent. So this is a strategy as well of another cloud concentration. One strategy that I did not talk about was the mixtures of different types. So in World War I, you would have, they called them yellow cross, green cross, blue cross. They would mix in persistent chemicals with non-persistent chemicals and then high explosives. So overall, you just have this really deadly cocktail and a complete nightmare. So we have more, and then we'll mix in some. Remember, the next. What do we need to do next? Some high explosives. Oh, that guy's a persistent chemical. He'll be like, oh. So we're gonna mix in some high explosives up here as well because we want to keep kicking up this dust. We want these chemicals to stay in the air longer. We want them to knock the gas mask off their faces. We want them to give them concussions. We want to drive them into foxholes. Crumble down buildings in just small, tight areas where, one, there's not much oxygen, there's not much air, so not much air is flowing through. There's obviously a lot of oxygen, but there's not much air flowing through that space, so the gas is going to settle in these small, low spaces. And then it's just going to allow us to, really, if we wanted to shut this breakthrough down, to even launch a counterattack. So if we hit start, we're going to see cloud concentration next. So you see they're pulling back and they're going to fall right into that cloud concentration. And basically this is what happened during that breakthrough is they saw many abandoned guns. And we haven't even talked about like the long-term strategy or the long-term effects of using chemical warfare on the battlefield. Now, if we really, now you have a bunch of contaminated weapon systems on the battlefield. Now let's say we were targeting their artillery guns, their command posts, things like that. Those systems are now contaminated. So now it's going to take longer to refit. It's going to take longer to clean them. And it's going to continue to get worse for them because they can't restock them appropriately. One, because the battlefield's dirty. It's a dirty battlefield now. Next, we're going to refer to things as chemical fires. So now we have several chemical fires going on the battlefield. So not only do we have a dirty weapon system, we have dirty tanks, we have a slowed down force, and we've determined that this battle space is just like unacceptable. If you want to operate in this area, you're going to have a bad time. So basically everything we're talking about is just layering gas, layering different forms of gas. So persistence, non-persistence, followed by high explosives, or you include high explosives to just kind of confuse them. So if we high explosive them, they go into their foxholes. Then we fire in some non-persistent or persistent chemicals. Once those chemicals are in there, they're in their foxholes. They settle down. Those gases come down, they settle in those foxholes where the soldiers are. More high explosives come in, cause concussions, knock their gas masks off, and just overall just have a terrible time. Then we expand our operation at a more tactical or a more strategic level where we target headquarters, and that's another US policy is to mainly go for headquarters. And the Russians have kind of narrowed their aspect down, narrowed down to that a little bit. And so as we go for the headquarters, we take out command structures, we disable weapon systems, we disable the ability to refit, and we just really increase time on the battlefield, and we really just shut the enemy down. So what looked like a really strong offensive was shut down with basically what? One round of high explosive and three gas grenades or three gases. And then here you have all of this falling on them. And then if we say, hey, they're still executing this water crossing, we come to our non-persistent. I believe we had a non-persistent right here. We say, oh, that's a persistent. Non-persistent right here. We give another barrage. We come up here and we just do like cloud concentration. Just shut it all down. Then we just keep them in their foxholes with high explosives. We only have one high explosive artillery battery, which is currently doing its job quite effectively. Then we hit start and proceed. So since this is a persistent chemical on the battlefield right now, right here, they're going to have to travel through this. And so they have several layers to travel through right now. They have a persistent chemical, which means they need to be in their MOP gear. So things like mustard gas was king of the battlefield in World War I, because it lingered on the battlefield for a long time. So soldiers assumed it wasn't around. And the second they started taking off their MOP gear, their gas masks, a few hours later, they would get blisters. They would get like all kinds of just blisters. And they would just have overall just not a good time. And there's a PDF talking about the World War I experience from the U.S. side. And really, then one reason why the Russians it's rumored that they truly embraced chemical warfare was from World War I, because they suffered a lot when the Germans, a lot of the casualties were on that Eastern Front, just like similarly to World War II. But we could talk more about World War II and quote like Winston Churchill, where he was just daring the Germans to kind of use chemical weapons on the battlefield because they really, really wanted to dive into that. So this whole area is shut down, right? These guys are trapped between a rock and a hard place. They have gas behind them. They have artillery falling behind them. They have gassed and persistent chemicals in front of them. And it's slowly dissipating, but that's fine, right? Because more is going to come in, more high explosive, more chemical war, more chemical gases, more persistent, non-persistent. And even though this is more of a delaying, if we had to reinforce this area or secure this bridgehead or keep it, right? These persistent chemicals aren't going anywhere. This non-persistent is going to fade slowly. We could easily push up. We could drop more artillery right here and kind of secure that position. They had one little breakthrough. So that's just something that's really, really, really important to consider. How the Germans dominated the battlefield offensively with chemical warfare. And that's one area that the U.S. kind of lacks right now is offensive capability with chemical weapons. It's not that we don't have the capability, it's that we don't have the confidence, the training. While we do train with chemical MOP gear, sea burning training, we don't train as extensively as other nations or even partner nations, or even rogue nations like Iran. Well, rogue, but just nations that are sanctioned. So Iran, Russia, Syria, all of them have combat experience around chemical warfare. And that kind of goes hand in hand with the U.S. right now, right? Russia is getting a lot of combat experience working in Ukraine, and they have combat experience with chemical weapons. And chemical weapons is something that's kind of a redheaded thing to the U.S. They don't really want to pick it up. They don't want to learn it, and they kind of focus on a usage of deterrence. Although nuclear is something we do consider a lot. That's the quick little tactics video. A lot longer than I thought it would be. Peace out, guys.